Welcome back. Well, it is February 27th, and I thought this would be a good day to film our introduction because what we've been dealing with today and what we've dealt with a couple of times in the past during this month that you've seen and also throughout January really gives us a heading to put these last 2 months on. And I think that a good way to characterize the last 2 months would be decision point. These last 2 months has been all about what we do and when to minimize the amount of power that we're pulling off of the utility grid and maximizing the solar input into the batteries, maximizing how much power is stored in the batteries, and really trying to figure out what is the most efficient use of that stored energy. As you saw, we made a few errors. We had a couple times where we maybe put too much power into the car, and we learned from those mistakes. And so in this last round of storms, we didn't do that. We let the system try and recover as naturally as it could. And right now we're sitting at about 23%. So let's back up just a little bit. We'll go over this again once we get to the studio, but I think it's important to talk about it here while I'm inspired by what is all going on right now. So as we were starting to come up to a point where we knew we were going to get a patch of rough weather, we started to make decisions based on what we learned about what we did previously by putting too much power into the car. We let the system operate more or less naturally. We came off, as you saw last week, we came off of zombie apocalypse mode. We wound up turning the grid power on. And what that gave us was the ability to, A, charge the batteries to 100%. When you're off grid power, it tends to limit it right up around 98%, 97, 98%, and it'll kick the system off. So we didn't want that to happen. We wanted that every little bit that we could get out of there. And then also when it depletes, it depletes down and then also will then wind up shutting the system out at some point. And so we wanted to make sure that, okay, if we get down to a certain point, we don't want the system to cut off and kill the house, so let's go ahead and make sure that we have some backup in the form of the utility grid. And I think that that's simply the way that people are going to naturally do their systems. Obviously, if you're in an off-grid situation, that's not what you're going to be doing. So we did notice one thing, that was how you set your reserve. How you set your reserve is very important, because what's going to happen then is the system is going to wind up depleting down to that point, and then it will obviously engage the grid. But it also does one other thing, and that is that if you are below the point at which you set for reserve, then what will happen is the system will take all of the solar power. Remember, we can't charge off of the grid, so we have to bring it from solar. So it will take all of the solar power, put it into the batteries, and it will obviously match that usage of the home, and so the home gets fed off of the grid power. Okay, so that then gives us our variables, what we're allowed to really play with. It isn't much, but it is something. And again, we'll go into that greater detail in the studio. But what we wound up doing then is, in the evening, we would set it to 0, provided, of course, wasn't going to be any kind of a major storm, and then allow the system to fully deplete. And then the following day, we would set it to a point that would do what we wanted to accomplish. Now, in that case today, I set it to 20%, because my goal for any charge, any amount of solar power that we were going to get today would be to get to 20%. Why? Well, I want it to get to tomorrow. Tomorrow's supposed to be a partially sunny day, and as we know from this time of year, we can expect in the 35 kilowatt hour range, provided the weather actually does what it's forecasted to do. And so with that in mind, I can then, with the knowledge that the next couple of days are going to be partly sunny, I can then go ahead and say, okay, the majority of the storm is past. Now we're not as in danger of a power outage happening. Obviously, if it happens tonight, we'll just ride it out until the morning. It won't be anything to worry about unless the power doesn't come on tomorrow, and then we can kind of deal with it then, and it would be a very fun thing to actually present to everybody. But like I said, so what we did was we set the system to 20%. Right now we're sitting at 23%. We peaked out at 24, but clouds came over later in the day. There's some load sharing between the power wall and what solar can provide now, and so then that depletes the battery a little bit at the tail end of the day. So it's leaving us at 23%. So with what we know now, we'll lose 20% between now and the time that solar begins to contribute tomorrow. So tomorrow I expect that we'll be at 3%. Tomorrow I'll also be filming the studio portion of our monthly closeout, and so you'll get a chance to see whether or not we made it. But like I said, this frames what really kind of sets the tone for these last 2 months, and that is decision point. How do we best program the systems to do what we've done this past 2 months automatically, or at least with less human intervention than we've actually put in thus far. Now, that said, in the future, the reason I have this out is from this point forward, we're probably not going to be discussing too much about decision point. I think that we've covered that aspect of it. I think we've covered it very well. We'll readdress decision point in October, again, when it rears its ugly head and we actually have to start making those decisions. And so now, the new focus for the next probably 2, 3 months, maybe 4 months, is power exchange. All right? Everything that is going to involve our lives in the 21st century is going to revolve around power transfer. We're going to be transferring from one storage medium to another storage medium from wherever that winds up being created. We're going to try and use the best possible sources to create our power. Then we're going to create batteries that store that power in the most efficient and long-term way possible. We're going to then sculpt those technologies to meet our needs. Does it have to be portable? Does it not? Can we then do something like a more mass storage situation where maybe those types of solutions will be more beneficial and more efficient, right? So as we move forward, that's going to be our new focus for probably the next 2 or 3 months, and that's going to be how efficiently we store it, what our losses are, how do we get the power from the batteries to the car, how much does the car use, because the times of barely making it to the next day, that's over. That's over. We're now starting to produce over 40 kilowatt hours of power every day that there is continuous sunshine. Even when the days are relatively nasty, we're doing 24. The temperatures come up, and the average use of the home right now is to that 24, 25, 26 range, right? And so we've hit that point where the home is more or less sustainable. And so now moving forward, we'll really get an opportunity to try some driving on the car, and we'll start to monitor that, and we'll also monitor the power transfers. And as we discussed in our last update, as we start to create more power, we're actually going to be able to see what our losses are. It's very difficult to calculate your losses when you're only generating, 15, 20 kilowatt hours in that range. For, on a very cloudy day, it becomes almost impossible to sort out what your losses are over your noise. And so we have that to look forward to as we move on. And so with that, thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and move over to the studio, and we'll take more of a deep dive into the numbers for this past week, and we'll close out the month. Welcome back to the studio. So we had a bit of an unusually long intro this time, so let's get right down to the mechanics of all of this after my long-winded prologue there. So what can we say we've learned from the past couple of months? Well, like I alluded to in the intro, the things that we have found out to this date mostly relate to decision point. The data that we're gathering is really critical. You'll see that here as we do this closeout, to being able to predict what we should ask the system to do at any given point in time, given the data that's available to us. So that was why I think that's a good way to describe this whole thing these last couple of months as decision point. So the conclusions are pretty clear, and that is that we need a way to bump charge the system with grid power when the power is cheap, whether that comes from solar or whether it comes from, you know, off-peak charges, that kind of a thing. But you know, being able to charge with small bits of grid power when we want to, that would be the ideal situation. But as we'll see here, augmenting it with solar power isn't that bad either. We do that by setting the reserve higher, and what that does is then it prioritizes the solar, and it basically what it does is it powers the home off of the grid while the solar produces. It's a little more confusing than that as far as the way the system actually does it. The solar is a contribution to the total, and then the system actually decides how much power it's going to divert, but we'll go into that, it's not important. We'll see how that works on 2 separate days this week, and then when we do next week's closeout, you'll probably see it crop up once more in month 3's first week. So let's start by picking up where we're left off on the 22nd of February. So it was a sunny day, 90% charge in the system. And then on the 23rd, that was partially cloudy weather starts to creep in. And again, if you remember the forecast from the previous week, that's what we were seeing. Daily use is at 25.8 kilowatts, and we replenished the system with 23.8, leaving us with a total solar day of 86%. And then on the 24th, the same. Home usage of 22.2 kilowatt hours, a little less usage from the home, but same weather pattern produces a fairly consistent result, as you can see. And so predictably, the 24.1 kilowatt hours. And so then on the 25th, this is where the weather really starts getting nasty. And so well, you see that we've got 21.6 kilowatt hours used and 9.5 replenishment, and that brings our total solar day again down a little bit, 68%. 26, well, bad weather again. And so again, what you're seeing is that these like weather patterns are producing similar kinds of production numbers. February 26th was even worse still, 3.5 kilowatt hours for the total production, total home usage of 26. But again, just as predicted in the forecast, heavy rains, and that left us with little production. So with the total solar day percentage now at 29%, back to that decision point. Now we have to start paying attention. We have to plan it. Well, what information do we have? If we were an autonomous system, what would we do? What information do we have that we can actually rely on, and what's our goal? So, if we get another day of bad weather, that's going to be a problem. And so it's time to now forecast. So let's pull up, this is the weather forecast, and now we can see what we're up against. So February 26th was a Tuesday, and the following 2 days were forecasted to be partially sunny with some rain. And we know from the past experience, again, this is why those data points and the notes are really important to keep track of like versus like. I've broken it up. You'll see that there are several different icons for what types of weather were prevalent during those periods. And as you'll see, pretty damn consistent. And so the following days were forecasted to be sunny with a little bit of rain. And so we know that that'll yield between 20 and 25 kilowatt hours a day, 30 if we get really lucky like we did that couple times where we got breaks in the rain right at peak production, and so those were really helpful. But 30 if we get really lucky, right? But can we depend on it? You know, what are we going to see? Is the forecast going to be right? You know, and so we were predicted to have 9% power at the time of first production on the 27th. And so what did we get? Well, here we go, 10%. And so again, these numbers seem to be really consistent, you know, provided we don't have some outrageous use in the evening. They just seem to be dead on. And again, the percentages relate to the size of our system. Everybody else, your system is going to be slightly different. And I'll get to what your goal is in a minute here. So that's the 27th. And so 10% first solar contribution and production of 18.8 kilowatts, right in there in that 20 kilowatt range, a little low. And total solar day, 23%. Pretty close to what we started the previous day. And so this tells us our decision point is pretty similar to our forecast. Pretty accurate. So one thing to remember is that in order to make it to the next day, right, we had to set our reserve to 0% on the evening of the 26th. And we did that again on the evening of the 27th, well, after any time after total solar day, when you're, you know, again, those points at which you're actually making your decision. And this allows the system to fully deplete. Right? Now, you know, normally with a winter storm, you want to keep some in reserve in case you have a power outage or what have you. But because this system is so large, it gives us some latitude. So what we're able to do is we know that the system's going to reduce that 20% overnight, but then we're going to wind up having some contribution the next day. Even if it's only, you know, 4 or 5 kilowatt hours, right? It's still something, right? And so that allows us to then go ahead and deplete the system, provided we know that there aren't any other factors involved, like a very heavy storm or something where we would really feel that there was a major need for saving some in reserve, because we know we're going to make it, and we're immune obviously to a power outage in that time. So the trouble comes in the following day, right? So the forecast was for another partially cloudy day on the 28th. Let's just bring up the 27th again here. And so you look at that from grid line, right? And so now what you'll see is that we used, where is it here? We used 2.8 kilowatt hours from the grid. And I'll show you why that is. On the evening of the 26th, we wanted to be able to be guaranteed that we'd make it, so we set the system to a 0% reserve, and we did make it, as you saw. But my concern then became the amount of production that we were going to get on the 28th. So what I did was to set the system to 20% reserve after 9%. Now, the result of that was that the system used that 2.7 kilowatts, reported 2.8, but that's some of the housekeeping and things that the gateway does, records a little bit different than what we're showing here. But 2.7 kilowatts went to the grid, and that augmented the solar on that day. Now, setting it to 20%, why? Well, because in our system, we know that if we get to 20%, we'll make it to the next day. All right, and so by using grid power while it was cheap, and while the household was consuming relatively little power, this allowed us to rapidly get the system up to 20%, boom, and now we'll return it to self-powered mode. It does it on its own, because once it once it achieves 20%, which you've set as your minimum because you want to get to the next day, anything else is gravy. And so in this case, I think it was like 23% or something. So here, where is this? Should that. And so here, as you can see, by noon, with the consumption of very little grid power, we actually stored enough power to get it through to the next day, even if we had a power failure. And so then the 28th, boom, again, pretty much following the forecast, just as predicted. Production was just under 30 kilowatt hours. Now, if we had left our solar, total solar day on the 27th at 23%, started at 5, would we have made it had we not put that 2.7 kilowatt hours in? Yeah, we would have. But we didn't know that at the time. And that's the important thing is, building that margin of safety as you go along. And that's going to be the key here. How much can we say for certainty, and how much of it was a guess? Well, we certainly didn't waste the power. Obviously, it's still in there. It's part of that 5% that we had left. And so now what? Well, now we go back to the forecast. Boom. And so this was the forecast on Thursday the 28th. All right. And so we're still sitting at 5%. System was starting to produce. Previous evening we had set the system at 0% so that, again, we can get down to that that reserve fully depleted. And then the prediction for the day is 43% cloud cover over the region where we are that is sufficient to produce rain. And we know, again, the historical data has showed us that we can predict 20 to 25 kilowatt hours on those types of days, 30 if we wind up getting lucky. So what did we do? Well, same thing we did the previous day. We prioritized making it to the next day without risking a power outage, right? So we wind up setting it to 20% again. Boom, here is the result of that. Quickly charged it shortly after noon, drew 3.7 kilowatt hours from the grid, and shortly after noon, here we have our 20%. The system returned to its self-powered mode, and then we ended up the day at 30%. So that was good. Our prediction was correct. We wound up on the higher end of that prediction because, again, we had that break in the weather right at peak production, so that helped. And so then finally, as is our tradition here, we'll close out with the day following that, the total solar day following that week. And so here we have March 1st. Boom. And as you can see, that this is listed as a maintenance day. SMUD sent a crew out to do an inspection of the system to confirm that it was active and that it conformed to both the drawings as well as all the labeling regulations that they had. And they did wind up shutting off the power briefly right at midday. And so it wasn't too big of a deal, but it did meet the criteria for recording that it happened as a maintenance day. And so, but as you can see, augmenting the charge with the grid the previous day paid off. And though the home's daily use was only 20.7 kilowatts, as you remember from last week, on certain days we had a higher than usual consumption during the time at which solar is producing. Today was one of those days, and again, because of that, we ended at a deficit, even though our production shows that it matched consumption. So that's about it. We'll pick up there next week as we kick off our third month for the Energy Sovereignty Project. But to close out, let's take a quick look at some numbers for the month. And so here, boom, this is showing the grid consumption, 152 kilowatt hours for the month, and you can see the trend, right? And this, what we're going to see continue, I'm sure. And so here's another graph showing it as a product of the total home use as it relates to consumption versus production and how much was stored in the power walls. And then let's pull up the numbers for that graph so you can kind of see the raw numbers that went into that. 152 kilowatt hours at average use or so of 25 kilowatt hours or so a day, and so that's approximately 1 week we ran off of grid power, and the rest of it was all from solar and batteries, and that lines up nearly exactly with what we see here. February, you know, over 3/4 of the power is being supplied by the system, so it's pretty cool. But that's it for this weekly closeout. I'll follow this up in a day or two with a closeout for the month, and at the end of that we'll also then review our year-to-date and see how we're doing. And so with that, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if this is the kind of thing that interests you, and do feel free to comment. Comments drive our content, and we'll be back with you soon.